I'm Dr. John with the Voyage Clinics podcast, family physician, and our objective is to just bring light and knowledge to our community that's good science-based. And today my guest is Dr. Richard Rasmussen. He's a bariatric surgeon and general surgeon. Dr. Rasmussen earned his bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University in 1994. That's good. A
few years ago.
Followed by a doctorate in medicine from University of Utah. Great program. Completed a general surgery residency at the Phoenix Integrative Surgical Residency Program in 2003. You became board certified general surgeon in 2004, named fellow of the American College of Surgeons in 2005, and 2011 recognized as a fellow of the American Society of Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery, and other things, other accolades. But that's just kind of a bullet. Dr. Rasmussen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit about you. Tell us about your family, your hobbies and interests, and then we'll dive into the topics.
Okay. Married to wonderful wife, Tammy. We have 6 children.
Nice.
We have 7 grandchildren, and still have a couple at home. I have a son who just graduated from high school and another son who will be a freshman in high school. So kind of a broad range in social life, I guess.
Yeah.
I love to travel. It's I think one way to escape, get away from the crazy, is, go somewhere else. I also enjoy wake surfing and skiing, but probably most importantly, just spending time with family.
Totally. I've learned about this wake surfing hack. It's just a great way to captivate your family. And you got them on a boat. You can talk and bond and hang out. I've been trying to figure out this hack for a while. How do I get my kids out in nature? Turns out wake surfing is the answer.
It's a great way. And you're right. They're captive. It's not too many places they can go.
That's right. Well, very good. Do you play pickleball?
No,
okay.
I don't.
That's okay. That's just no big deal. I mean, it is an undertone to our podcast generally. No, that's wonderful though. That's super fun to meet you. Dr. Rasmussen, you and I kind of met a little bit earlier this year at a medical conference. As physicians, we have the opportunity to kind of keep learning and growing all our careers and doing these continuing medical education conferences. And you were one of the presenters there. And after your presentation, I thought, not only are you local to my clinic here in Utah County, but also your presentation was just so good. And
thank you.
I feel like there's a lot of information out there around weight loss, and there's a lot of misinformation. We live in the age of misinformation, right? Everything is a TikTok video or social media thing, and somebody's saying something, and they're a PhD expert on blah, blah, blah. So it's fun to just nerd out with the boots on the ground people, the scientists who are out there, the docs that are out there doing the thing. So I appreciate your presentation, and we'll probably use it just as a little bit of a scaffolding today to kind of build around. But I'd love to just hear kind of your thoughts around the obesity epidemic. You showed some slides from like 2011 to present, and we had in Utah, I think we were like less than 20% obesity rates. But even in like most of the West Coast, there was like really not as bad as obesity. And then each year you can see, and if you go to like cdc.gov or whatever, you can kind of look at this progression of obesity in America and how profound it is. And what do you think are some of the driving factors there?
Wow, that's there's a lot to unbundle there. It's typically, when I talk about it, it's kind of an intersection of 3 different things. It's our environment, our genetics, and our behaviors. And the interesting thing, if you look at that time period of, the last 30, 40 years, there really hasn't been a big change in genetics over that time period. Yeah. So it has to fall more in behavior and our environment. And there have been a lot of people who've done research on and then comments on kind of our food source and what we're eating. I believe that's the primary issue. It's what we're eating, how it's been modified, how that interacts in our bodies, and then that leads to this excessive weight gain. And once somebody enters the obese category, then it's a huge fight against biology, because our bodies are built to maintain weight or gain weight, store for the future, but they don't easily go the opposite direction in trying to get it off.
Understandably so, right? We're survivalists. Our bodies are built to help us survive. And so slagging off the extra pounds that we snuck on during the holiday seasons can be a real bear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Culturally, for sure, as a family doc, I mean, I deal with this all the time in the primary care space. And it is hard. It is so hard because everything is sugar. I mean, birthdays, you've got celebrations, you've got 4th of July stuff, you've got Halloween, and it's just all built around processed sugar. And those little calories sneak into our mouths somehow. Why am I chewing on this thing? I had no intention of doing that. And then they just stack up over time. And here we are, 5 pounds heavier per year. And then there you go. And it's just sneaky. It's very subtle.
What's fascinating to me is it's come into every aspect, right? I mean, you put your kids in soccer and there has to be a treat at the end of the game. And now there has to be a halftime treat and an end of the game treat. And usually that's a sugared drink or, something like that. And it's fascinating to me. The other thing that I think is very interesting, and I use this sometimes in presentations, but if you look at the story I like to tell is a story of Oreos. Here was a cookie back in, I think, the 1950s created, and you go 20, 30 years and it really doesn't change much. And then if you look in the last, 15 years or so, there's now, last I looked, over 70 varieties of Oreos. Well, that's amplified across every other product. Look at Doritos, right? Doritos used to be a type of chip. Now look at all of the different flavors and types, and you can take any candy bar, any of those types of treats, and you can see them just amplified. And so now if you're a taster, I'm a taster, I like tasting things. If I want to try to taste everything that exists, there's no way I'm going to get through all that exists. And as you mentioned, I'm stacking that weight because I'm constantly trying to try all those different things.
Dr. Falahati Ali Reza, he's a endocrinologist here in our community, and he and I spoke about sugar and just the amount of sugar and the extent of sugar. But it's really not just sugar, it's really processed foods. And they are hiring Oreo, these other folks out there, Dorito, they hire PhD level biochemists to create substances to put in your food to make them excessively alluring to our appetite.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
both coming back, no one can eat just one, the Lay's the Lay's chips. And it's true. It is so true. They do that on purpose. Extra salt, extra fat, extra sugar, extra MSG, like all these things that enhance our taste, and like, holy crap, that was so good, I need to eat more. And then it leads to this excessive consumption. And here we are in the obesity epidemic.
And the functional MRI studies that show your brain light up when you eat those things. And they know what they're doing. It's not It's not naive.
The same addiction centers as like crack, meth, like all these addiction space. They're smart about it. And it's a tricky little situation. When we live in a capitalist society, it's hard to make those changes. However, I think there's hope. I think as we bring more education and understanding around these spaces, we can change the culture and then hopefully change the habits. Culture has to shift though. I mean, in the last 30 years, we've made a massive cultural shift around smoking. And so, I mean, granted there's vaping now, but the smoking is so much different now than it was when I was a kid. Like my dad smoked his whole life, and man, now to find smokers out there, like real smokers, like it's not very common.
True.
And so I think we have the capacity as a culture to make these kinds of changes. And if we can just put more and more information out there, I think it'd be beautiful. The South is particularly challenging. I did residency in med school in the South in Florida, and there are some deep culture. Dr. Sanders, I'm never going to quit my sweet tea. Like no, the answer is no. And you want me to drink some stevia in that? Forget about it. It needs to be sugar, and I need to sip on it all day long. And so there are some deeper cultures than others. But I do think there's hope here, and I think we do need to look at it culturally. We need to shift our thinking around birthdays. Maybe serve something different. Let's consider a fruit thing, or change it up a little bit.
That's funny. We in family activities, our family is typically the one that brings the veggie platter. I mean, that's kind of who we are. Yeah. So
my wife is the same. She's like, this dessert platter, like, we're gonna do fruit, and I'm gonna bring some veggies. Yeah, it's so cute. She's like a crusader for that. Let's talk about the obesity, what it leads to. What's the cascade of things in our bodies that we see? It puts you at increased risk of a whole bunch of things. Talk to us about that.
There are a ton of diseases, and probably the most obvious are type 2 diabetes. The vast majority of patients who deal with type 2 diabetes have obesity as well. Hypertension, and then reflux, joint disease, cancers are more prevalent in patients with obesity. So there's lots of different comorbidities, diseases that come with obesity. In addition, there's good data showing that patients who live with obesity and therefore likely a lot of these diseases have lower life expectancies than those who don't. And you can actually show that if people change where their weight profile, if they change how heavy they are, if they change their obesity, that actually improves their longevity.
Totally. The number one killer of America continues to be atherosclerotic disease, and it's just the buildup of plaque on blood vessels causing heart attacks and strokes. And so I think this is like a trickle down effect of that for sure, including the high blood pressure, the diabetes with the microvascular issues that causes there. But I also think like there's dementia stuff that happens here.
Type 3 diabetes?
Type 3 diabetes. Yeah, you got it. Gallbladder stuff. I've got a gal with gallbladder things right now in the clinic I'm talking to. Headaches and migraines. And I'm not sure why that is, but like, is it the processed food or is it both or what? But it's super interesting. Sleep apnea, big time thing. All these comorbidities, we call them comorbidities, but in English, I guess the term is diseases, right? Multiple things that affect our body toward a negative direction. All of these create a huge economic impact. And you probably don't have these numbers memorized, but during your presentation, you presented in 2019, there's direct and indirect cost. And so you could say that like the comorbidities or the other diseases that are from obesity have an indirect and direct impact on financial impact. And the economic impact, you said in 2019 was $705.72 billion. And in 2030, it's projected to be $1.5 trillion. And then in 2060, it's going to be 2.6 trillion plus. And that is a massive economic impact. And I think we have to look at it, right? We have to address it. Yeah. Something's got to change.
Well, let's just take type 2 diabetes, right? So type 2 diabetes, if you have that uncontrolled, particularly, your risk of kidney failure is much higher, right? And so you take one patient who has kidney failure who's now on dialysis or needs a transplant, immunosuppressants. I mean, and that's the extreme, right? You just take just the medications to treat it to try to get it under control. I mean, those are so expensive, right? And then you add hypertension on top of that, so you're taking your antihypertensive. It is a very expensive disease process. And then I'm a general surgeon. I do that also, not just bariatric surgery. And so when I see patients with hernias or even with the gallbladder disease, if they come in with gallbladder disease and they're morbidly obese, their risk of complications going through that operation is much higher than somebody who's not obese. And so if they have complications, that's more expensive. So, a lot of costs involved in treating this disease.
All right. So let's talk about treating it. What are our options here? I mean, I work in the primary care space, so my whole thing is diet and exercise, lifestyle, the psychology piece, trying to get people into therapy. Often our relationship with food is poor. We sometimes are comfort eaters, sometimes stress eaters, and sometimes like just eaters, of snackers, of all things.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I mentioned, of those 3 parts, behavior is one as well. And that's really what the behavior speaks to is am I using food as a drug? Am I using it to cope with the different situations?
Yeah. What other treatments are effective that you've noticed out there? I mean, we talk about diet, exercise. I mean, there's these meal replacements that work pretty well. I think they just take the me out of the equation, right? They take the addiction and they take the fMRI, lighten up and all that out of the equation and say, here's your meal for this meal, here's your meal for that meal. Those actually work. And they're pretty good. There's obviously medications. That's my space. I do that all the time. And then there's alternatives. There's all types of, and some of these are gimmickry, right? So we have all the dietary supplements and things, but some of them are decent as well. There's some good evidence there. But yeah, other things to treat this epidemic.
Well, obviously my space is surgery, right?
Yeah.
And in my mind, that's kind of the, whether you want to call it the top or the bottom of this, grouping that we're creating. Typically we think of surgery as, well, if these other things aren't working for me, then there is surgery. Surgery, if you take all of the other options on a population basis, because there are individuals who will be different in this, but from a population standpoint, you're going to lose more weight, keep it off longer with surgery than you are with any of those other options.
Yeah. Can we briefly go into the medical options?
Sure.
Just talk about them. There's some age-old ones, and then there's some newer kind of ones, and there's some combo ones that are old medicines that they combinize to recreate patents and charge a bunch of money. But can we speak to that? Just
sure,
speak to
absolutely.
those briefly.
So I think we probably start off with fen-phen, right? Because everybody's heard about fen-phen and phentermine and fenfluroxamine was kind of hit the scene, and people were excited about it because here's a medication to help with obesity, and we're talking 20, 30 years ago. And then of course, one of those caused heart problems, and so it was taken off the market. But phentermine has persisted since then, and it's basically a stimulant and helps people kind of get some control over appetite. And still used. You probably use it. Still used pretty wisely.
It's so inexpensive. It's a reasonable option, but it is a stimulant, and it's very molecularly close to Adderall, actually. And so sometimes you got the dual effect of helping with some focus. We live in a neuro-programmed ADD society right now. Yep. So, but I don't like it for long term. And,
right.
We got to cycle off and then you got to, I like it to establish habits and then hopefully really resculpt and retrain ourselves because you're right, the cravings are less and the weight loss is easier. But yeah, you got to establish the habits or you just rebound back up.
Yeah. Awesome. And so that was, that's been around for a long time. And then there were some other attempts. There's one called Orlistat, which is a fat blocker. So the fat you eat doesn't get absorbed, but it creates really smelly stool and diarrhea. So people really didn't like to use it.
My favorite side effect of that one is the anal leakage. Nobody likes that.
Exactly.
What?
And then about 14 or so years ago, there were 4 new medications that came in, a couple of them combination medications, which are really the only ones that have probably persisted from that time period. And using medications like Wellbutrin, naltrexone, which were medications that already existed, but then putting them in a combination to help basically decrease appetite. We don't understand exactly the mechanisms of how they work, but here was, finally the first FDA-approved medications for years, and they, created a lot of buzz, and they're helpful, but typically, they were approved on studies that if you could show a 5 to 10% difference in initial weight loss, then they were approved. And if somebody weighs 300 pounds and they lose 5%, that's 15 pounds. They're like, well, I could have done that with, going hitting the gym or, whatever. And so for the expense of them, they really never caught on, I think, as primary treatments.
I like the Wellbutrin naltrexone combo. I sometimes compound it locally because it's cheaper.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, but I like it especially for like food addiction space. The Wellbutrin or bupropion increases dopamine, norepinephrine in our brains, helps with, similar to Adderall, similar to phentermine, they help with focus and things like that. So that's cool. But also sometimes just relationship with food, we tend to there's like an addiction space. Naltrexone we've used traditionally for like alcoholism and other addicts. It just hits that like almost that like mu receptor in our brain that is stimulated from alcohol or even sometimes food, and kind of just calms it down. So then your like craving is like reasonable instead of hyper craving, because we have the hyper delicious food thing and it's really hard to rescript that. So this kind of like stacks the deck in their favor a little bit. Those ones I would say a little bit safer longer term than the phentermines and things like that with the adverse effects on body and heart and things like that. And then the topiramate space, also one that's been around forever for migraines, and combining it with some medicines sometimes help. And we noticed it caused weight loss too, because your appetite's just suppressed a little bit. Can we kick into the most popular space a little bit?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, I'd love to hear your talk on it.
So, most commonly referred to as GLP-1 agonists. That's one of the mechanisms, of course.
People call them the injectables.
The injectables. The
injections.
Yep.
You doing the shot?
The shot. There we go. That's probably a better term. The shot. As I did research for that presentation, I was actually intrigued by how long they've actually been used in the weight loss space. But it's really only the last few years that they become so popular. And probably part of that is behind the fact that Big Pharma said, hey, we've got a solution for weight loss and let's call it this name and we'll charge, outrageous amounts of money for it and help people lose weight. And they're effective. And I think that's why people are excited about them as well, is because they are generally effective. And I think part of it too, comes back to my surgical space, because the scientists in surgical weight loss are very interested in what's happening metabolically in the body when we reroute somebody's anatomy, when we take out part of the stomach, when we do these different connections. And so they've studied these different gut hormones and how they interact with the brain, and how that fat set points and satiety and all those different things. And so they've been able to show what these different operations do with these different hormones. And then what we're seeing is that these medications are basically mimicking what's happening with the operations with these different hormones. And just to kind of make it simple, it's you're blocking the effect that some of these the foods have as they pass through the first part of the small intestine, and they create this cascade of events which ultimately stimulate the pancreas to secrete insulin, which aids or causes weight gain or resists weight loss, and then also interacts with the brain of, am I hungry? Am I full? And so the two most common or talked about would be semaglutide and tirzepatide. Semaglutide, of course, acting on GLP-1 specifically, and then tirzepatide acting on GLP-1 and GIP. They are effective. And right now, they're probably the closest to surgical weight loss of the other options. But the current data suggests also that they need to be taken lifelong. If you look at the studies that have been published, as people come off the medications, the weight comes back on. Right.
And I think that also speaks to our culture and the hyper addictive nature of our food supply and processed foods, especially. And again, in the primary care space, I'm trying to fight that battle, because I'm like, I don't want you on this medicine forever. So how do we rescript that? Like, how do you create a different culture in your mind and creating we have to create those kinds of situations, but it is a real bear to kind of get there, which speaks to your point where people typically rebound up unless they stay on it lifelong. So total expense, we're talking really expensive. I mean, in the compounding space, we can get these for maybe $100 to $150 a month. For semaglutide, tirzepatide is almost twice that. And so, and then in the brand name space, they're $800, $900, $1,100 a month. And so if your insurance covers it, wonderful. If it doesn't, you're hosed. And some insurances are starting to look at that because they're looking at the big picture total expense. And so if they're really smart, I think they would cover some things like that.
But you take that, that $300 a month, there's $3,600 a year.
Yeah.
If you're on that for 5 years, there's, what's my math, $18,000, something like that. So, I mean, it adds up.
You mentioned the words fat set point. Can you break that down for us?
So basically that is the concept that your body has a weight that it wants to live at. And so no matter what you do, you just seem to stay at that weight.
Yeah. I think we've all experienced that.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately.
And when I stated earlier that you're fighting biology, that's one of those comments, right? I mean, your body is actively fighting. So if for example, you say, okay, I know I need to consume less calories so I can get my weight down. What your body's going to do is it's going to say, okay, I'm going to decrease how much you burn calories. Yep. I'm going to be more efficient about hanging on to those. Yep. So now you've reduced your calories, but your body responded. And so that, mathematically that reduction didn't work didn't work as well as you'd hoped it would because your body was compensating for that. So that's part of that biological fight.
Do you know anything does this happen as a young child, the fat set point? Because I see in the formula thing, right, with kids who are formula fed, they're getting maybe more than breast milk fed kiddos. There are more obesity, more things like that with formula fed kiddos than breast milk fed kiddos. So I wonder where that fat set point starts, and then obviously it lands somewhere in your adulthood, and then you're just kind of struggling to get below that if you can.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. There is an interesting study. So looking at patients who gain a lot of weight for one reason or the other, they get sick. Pregnancy is a big one for women, but they put on a bunch of weight. The question we don't have the answer is how long do you have to get that weight off before it then becomes kind of more of your permanent set point? There is an interesting study in mice that it was a year that, if you fed them, really heavy diet, they put on a bunch of weight, you could get that to come back down within that year. But once you got past that year, then it's as if, you reset that set point. So in humans, we have no idea what that is. But for, patients who have recently gained a bunch of weight, I think that's the best time to really work
Get aggressive.
with them. Exactly.
Yeah. So they don't recalibrate to a new fat set point.
Yeah.
It's interesting how our bodies are made. Like the goal for it to just maintain something, right? So if you change that set point, your body's going to fight you, and it's going to be like, no, we need to consume more, and your fat cells are starving now. And so, so to really get past that is a bear. What percentage, like 15, 20% weight loss with some of these? I've seen some more dramatic ones. I like to keep it like more reasonable as far as a healthy weight loss. How much weight loss is reasonable, and when are you getting some of the muscular atrophy thing, and when do you be concerned about that kind of thing?
So, typically when I talk with patients about trying to answer those questions, it's all in statistics, right? And some patients are going to do better, some patients are going to do worse. But if you look at kind of the more prominent studies, somewhere in the 10 to 15% initial body weight lost is typical for semaglutide, and tirzepatide will get you more like 15 to 20%. So definitely higher with the dual action medication than with the single action medication. And maybe since we are kind of focusing on medications at the moment, there are some new ones coming down the line. There's a triple action one that's being studied, and so the hope from the pharmaceutical space is that, hey, we're going to have other options, because one of the things that anybody in this space knows is there is no magic bullet, right? There's no one answer. And the body's very adept at overcoming whatever changes you focus on. So if I'm targeting this, well, it's going to make that less important. And so the more ways you can target it, the better.
Totally. Adaptation. Our bodies adapt.
Yeah.
And gosh, this is such an interesting space. And the GLP-1s, the GIPs, the way that they work is significant. One of the concerns about them is this muscular atrophy, and muscular tone over time is linked to longevity and a whole bunch of other things. How many pounds per week is reasonable to maintain or resist that muscular atrophy? What are your thoughts there? Whether it's through the medicine or
however you're losing weight, and that's a good point. The body is somewhat indiscriminate on how you're losing the weight, right? Mm-hmm. And so if the scale is your only marker, you are missing some key points. So there is some newer data which suggests that to try to counteract that muscle wasting or muscle loss, you need to consume at least 100 grams of protein per day, and you need to do resistance training at least twice a week. And so that will essentially kind of stabilize it. And then you can use different studies. You can use DEXA scans or bioimpedance scales to try to get a sense of, what am I doing with my muscle mass? Am I losing it? Am I just losing fat mass? And those are helpful to kind of get an idea on what you're doing. But I know there is some ongoing research. We worked with some people trying to look at different types of exercise to limit that muscle loss during rapid weight loss. So the thing I encourage my patients to do is really push your protein and really work on resistance training. It's not just cardio. It's actually probably resistance training is probably more important.
100%. I feel like if people ate more protein and did more resistance training, we would win the battle of obesity anyway.
There's lots of truth to that.
So then they're just doing a little bit extra to bolster themselves. That's really cool.
And what's interesting too is kind of the misperceptions about that, right? As I have conversations, just not necessarily with patients, but with just, friends or associates in the community, and they talk about, how much protein do I need? And as a rule, people really undershoot where they should be based on their activity level, based on where they are in life. Those needs actually increase. And so most of the time people are undershooting.
Yeah. We have an electrical impedance scale at the office. I think DEXA scan is my next thing. I'd like to get one. I think it's really helpful. It's the most accurate way to see body composition. But electrical impedance scale is pretty sweet, and ours is really nice, really good. So we try to track that a little bit and encourage resistance and protein and all those things. That's really good. Let's pivot a little bit to your specialty now. We've talked enough about, laid a nice little background. Let's get into the surgical options, and I'll let you just take it.
Okay. Surgery for weight loss has been around for probably 40 plus years, and it's really evolved a lot over that time period. One of the most effective initial operations had a lot of complications, and so it's no longer done. There were several that looked at, reconfiguring the stomach, stapling the stomach in different ways, and those weren't as effective, and so those have kind of gone away. And so where we are currently, I would say there's two primary operations that are offered throughout the United States. And then there's some, I'm going to just call them secondary just because of the amount that they're used. And so the most popular would be a sleeve gastrectomy. And it's called a sleeve because you take this normal stomach, which is kind of a leather bottle shape, and you make it into a tube, into a sleeve. And you do that by cutting off the what's called the fundus part of the stomach. And it largely works because it's a restrictive operation. So you just can't consume as many calories. But yet you're satiated, you're full, you feel good with those, that amount of food that you're eating. If you look at studies in individuals who lose a significant amount of weight, and this goes back to, basal metabolic rate and fat set point, the things we talked about before, those individuals have to forever for the rest of their life consume fewer calories than somebody who is never been obese but is at that same weight. So two people, same weight. The person who's lost a significant amount of weight has to consume fewer calories to be able to maintain that weight compared to the person who never was obese. And so that's where a surgical stomach has a significant benefit, is because they can consume that smaller amount, those fewer calories, and, be full and not feel like, they're just hungry all the time. And so that's where it's a benefit. Sleeve gastrectomy really started coming on about probably 2009, in that time period. And it was actually part of a more complex operation, and that was being done in 2 stages. And the sleeve was the first part. And then they found, there's some patients, they do really well with just the sleeve part. And so then it kind of took off as its own operation. And it gained a lot of popularity because surgically it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. The risks are very low. And so, patients could have an operation, really low risk, and then they had a very effective tool to get weight off. Lap band was kind of at its peak about that time, and people were attracted to lap bands because they weren't, quote unquote, altering their anatomy. It was less risk. But unfortunately, it was not as effective. And it was kind of bimodal, meaning there were some patients who did really well and then other patients who just did not do well. And so a lot of bands went in, but only a percentage of those patients were doing well. In contrast, sleeve gastrectomy, as those were being performed, most patients did really well. And so it became a very popular operation, and currently in the United States is the most common surgical operation for weight loss.
The gastric banding, I've seen both of those cases in my primary care space, where the gastric band is like the guy is totally drinking, eating around it, or however he's still maintaining a tremendous amount of obesity. And I've seen him work a little bit, and I've seen some complications with those as well, with the band kind of eroding part of the stomach and things. The gastric sleeves, seen a whole bunch of those, and I think the nutritional deficiencies a little bit I see, and we got to kind of monitor things, initially like 3 times, 4 times a year, and then afterwards at least annually, unless they start feeling bad. Absorption of iron and things like that. But 20 to 30% weight loss with the sleeve is typical, and with the band, maybe like 15 to 20% on your presentation. That's what I recall.
That's correct.
And then anything else? When would a person decide, okay, I need to talk to my doc about maybe a gastric sleeve or a gastric sleeve or.
In considering surgical weight loss, it's really geared for patients who are what we call morbidly obese. And morbidly obese currently is defined as at least a BMI of 40. So BMI, is just a calculation based on weight and height to kind of try to, because if you have somebody who's 6'7" and weighs 300 pounds, that's very different from being 5'7" and weighing 300 pounds. Right. So it's a way to try to, other than just weight, to understand what's the impact of weight for that individual. And so if somebody has a BMI of 40 and above, or a BMI of 35 with comorbidities, that's considered, quote unquote, morbid obesity. And that's currently where most of surgical weight loss happens, is, those numbers and above. Now, interestingly, as operations, there's kind of a whole story behind this, but those numbers really came out in the early 1990s, in a consensus conference where at this point gastric bypass had been around in its current form for 10 years or so, and they were seeing, hey, here's an effective way to help people lose weight. But it's a surgical operation. At that time, they were done open, so a big midline incision. There were, wound infections, hernia risks, even some deaths and other complications. And so the consensus conference was to really try to determine who's the right patient to offer surgical weight loss to. And the question in my mind, what they were asking is, at what point are the risks of surgery less than the risks of continuing to live with the disease.
Totally.
And so they settled on, based on the data they had at that time, BMI of 35 with comorbidities, with diseases, with obesity-related diseases, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, et cetera, or a BMI of 40 and above. And that's persisted ever since then until about 4 or 5 years ago, the societies who do surgical weight loss, the SMBS and the IFSO, they said, you know what, these operations are a lot safer than they were back then. We do almost all of them minimally invasively, either laparoscopically or robotically, so small little incisions, and they're much safer. So, we could actually lower these numbers and still achieve those goals of doing them in patients where it makes sense from a safety profile. And so currently, the recommendation from them is a BMI of 30 with type 2 diabetes or other comorbidities, or a BMI of 35 and above. So they've brought that down.
Oh, they brought it down.
Yeah, about 5 points on each of those. And there are a few insurance companies who have followed that, particularly with type 2 diabetes, particularly in patients who've had a lot of trouble controlling their type 2 diabetes. So if somebody falls in that range, or they have these comorbidities and they're really having a difficult time controlling them, then that's really where surgical weight loss shines. That's where they can get a lot of help. And I will make a comment that particularly with type 2 diabetes, the best time to act is with a new diagnosis or a very recent diagnosis, because the ability to obtain remission, long-term remission, is much, much higher in the early phases of that disease than the later phases. Once you've had the disease for a while and now you're adding multiple medications and you're even on insulin, basically you've burnt out your pancreas and it just can't recover. And so it's much better to act in the early time of that disease.
What else do we talk about gastric sleeve? And I guess there's the other, but gastric bypass. Can you speak to that space a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So gastric bypass, in surgical weight loss, that's what we call the gold standard. It's been around the longest. It's been studied the most. We know the most about that operation. And it's really with the gastric bypass that the term a metabolic operation has come around. And I referenced earlier the science around what is it doing with gut hormones. When it was originally made, the scientists who started doing the operation, they said, well, what we're doing is we're making a small gastric pouch so people can't eat as much, and we're going to bypass some of the intestine so they don't absorb as many nutrients. And so that was their intent. What we've learned is there's really not much macronutrient malabsorption, meaning proteins, carbohydrates, fats. Those still are absorbed almost 100% with gastric bypass anatomy. There is micronutrient malabsorption. So to your point, labs should be checked regularly. Somebody who has this anatomy needs to follow up with their physician regularly. But what we learned is that there is actually a metabolic effect. And so it's changing how those gut hormones work. And the simplistic way that I like to explain it is food is no longer going by the first part of the small intestine. It's no longer going by the pancreas. And so it's stimulating the pancreas differently. And probably the easiest way to explain that is I will have patients with mild or moderate type 2 diabetes who come in, have a gastric bypass, and they will leave the hospital a day later not taking any of their diabetes medications with normal blood sugars. So that is not just due to weight loss. That's due to something additional, and that's what we call that metabolic effect. So as I mentioned, you're making a small gastric pouch, and then you're hooking the small intestine to that gastric pouch, and thereby that's why it's called a bypass, because you're bypassing that first part of the small intestine. Done minimally invasively, robotically, laparoscopically, it is also a low-risk operation. Currently, it's the same risk as any other abdominal operation. Even having your gallbladder removed, it's as low of that risk. And obviously, patients who have more diseases are at higher risk, no matter what operation they have. And so that's the same with surgical weight loss. And if you look at the amount of weight lost with a sleeve and a bypass, it's about 10% if you look at national numbers. In other words, with a gastric bypass, you're going to lose about 10% more than you do with a sleeve gastrectomy. In our clinic, our numbers are more about 5%, and I think that's probably because we treat patients the same, doesn't matter which procedure they've had, and working like you are, helping them trying to change how they're eating, what they're eating, their activity level, working on the mental aspects of it. But where a bypass really shines is in particularly moderate type 2 diabetes, because there's a much higher long-term remission from type 2 diabetes with a gastric bypass than there is with a sleeve, and with severe reflux. So bypass anatomy tends to eliminate reflux in about 90% of patients. So if I have patients come in, they've got severe reflux and they're obese, then a gastric bypass is really the better operation.
Thanks for lining those two out, because I was going to add, that was my next question. Why would you choose one versus the other? It sounds like more weight loss and then also less reflux and things like that. Yeah. That's really cool.
And the type 2 diabetes. That with a sleeve gastrectomy, you can have remission of type 2 diabetes, particularly if it's mild. If it's just you're in the beginning stages, you get about a 75% long-term remission of type 2 diabetes with a sleeve gastrectomy and significant weight loss versus 90% with a gastric bypass with mild disease. But once you move into moderate disease, it's only about 25% with a sleeve versus 60% with a bypass. And then if you move into severe disease, it's only 25% no matter which operation you get.
Oh, interesting.
So again, speaking to the importance of getting on it early.
Early, can you give us a time frame, like first couple years?
Yeah, first couple of years.
Or when the A1C reaches a certain number?
There isn't any data to say at what point that is, other than the components you look at are how long you've had the disease, the number of medications you're taking, and whether your hemoglobin A1C is below 7 or not. So as each of those things increase, your severity of disease increases.
Interesting.
So you could have somebody come in, they've only had it for a year, but their A1C is 9.6 and they're on 3 medications. They're already into moderate disease, pushing on severe disease.
A lot of people are going, well, let's speak to the insurance space. So just as the GLP-1s and the GIPs are like sometimes covered, they're becoming more covered. How about this? Is it reasonably covered by most insurances with those set points of BMIs, et cetera, or are we still struggling to kind of get coverage there?
I would say reasonably covered. It is covered by Medicare and Medicaid. So you would think everybody else should cover it.
Yeah.
However, they don't. In our local community, there are some big players that do cover it for most of their patients. One of the things that, in my opinion, has been a big disservice in the United States when it comes to obesity care is the Affordable Care Act's position on, and I just forgot the term of them, but basically they're a set of diseases that have to be covered. So about half of the states in the United States have to cover obesity care and the other half don't. And Utah is one of those that doesn't. So if you look at the marketplace and trying to get an insurance on the marketplace, none of those plans are going to cover obesity care, obesity surgery, because they're just trying to give you the lean, bare bones plan, which, ironically is to the disadvantage of anybody who has obesity, right? Yeah. And so that's been one of the things I've fought against, struggled with for the last several years. Had the opportunity to work with an insurance company in trying to change their plan, and we were successful in doing that. And so
obese patients in some states are better off than obese patients in Utah. Yeah. That's hard.
Yeah.
That's really silly.
Absolutely. And so I guess for your listeners, what I would suggest is if, call up their insurance, find out if their plan covers it. If it does, great. If not, go to their employer. Because when I talk to insurance executives, they tell me, oh, it's the employer, they're not asking for it. They don't want it. They just want a cheap product. And so it's really if the individual members will talk to their employer and say, hey, I need a plan that covers this, that's where, hopefully we would see some change.
Cool. Part of our mission at Voyage Clinics is to bring affordable, transparent healthcare to our communities. The annual gastric bypass recommended panel of blood work for our clients it can be expensive if someone's cash pay or even with a deductible, especially if they don't cover those kinds of obesity care things. You got to pick a different ICD-10 code. Ours, that could be thousands of dollars worth of labs, and we can get it for, I'm just looking at the amount, less than $200 easy.
That's awesome.
Is there space in bariatric surgery for transparent pricing for like, hey, we can get the surgery for you for this much? And surgical centers all charge a ton of money. Like I just recently had knee surgery, and the surgical center made 4 times what the surgeon was making. And I'm like, what is going on here? But are we doing some transparent things there in the surgical space? Barring, I've had some patients go to Mexico, right? So these surgeons, these Mexican doctors, or whoever is staffing those, often train in the States. They go down there, they do the surgeries, and they can charge much, much less. I think there's some caveats there, and I'd love for you to talk about what you've seen from those spots.
You're opening up a whole can of worms there.
Yeah. Dr. Lee Trotter and I did a podcast, and he mentioned that the procedure takes several sets of these staples that they use to do the gastric sleeve, and this is just for example. But in Mexico, sometimes they skimp on that, and they only do 2 sets instead of 4 or 3 sets instead of 4. And yes, it makes it less expensive, but then you have some poor outcomes and maybe some failing of the procedure, et cetera. But anyway, let's go back to the affordable pricing, transparent pricing. I think university or the Oklahoma Surgical Center has been really cool. They've done a lot of transparent pricing on, this is how much a knee replacement costs here, cash. This is what it is. And that's neat. I think we're seeing more and more of that in the surgical space. In the bariatric surgical space, is there a movement in that direction at all, or are we still just kind of fighting with insurance to get it covered?
Great question. Complicated answer. If you look over the last, let's say 10, 15 years, bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery has gone from almost no coverage by insurance, including Medicare and Medicaid, to now where it's covered by, a significant number, but not all. In those early days, cash pricing was about all that was available. And so it's well known in the surgical community how to do that, what to do with it. And all of us that do this have those cash prices. You pointed out a couple of barriers in that what I get paid as a surgeon is a fraction of what a facility gets paid. And, they have a lot of regulations to keep the doors open. They've got employee staff. And then there's the disposables, the staplers, the other things that we use, the drapes, all of that. And so there's some significant costs in there. And, depending on how much we want to dive into this, what's the cause of all that? Well, we can talk about third-party payers and medical healthcare economics and all of that.
That's another podcast.
Exactly.
We'll do it.
Exactly.
It'll be fun.
But basically, it's those things are more expensive in the United States than they are in other countries.
It's true.
And so if I'm looking, even if we use the exact same stapler here and in Mexico, it's going to cost less in Mexico than it is going to cost here.
Lots of reasons for that. It's very complex.
Right. So, as United surgeons in the United States, we tend to make all kinds of comments about what's happening outside of our borders. As a rule, I think most surgeons are well-intentioned, and they're trying to do a good job, and they're not trying to cut corners, and they're trying to help patients out, and they just live in an environment where it's cheaper to do it than it is here. The biggest problem I have with medical tourism when it comes to obesity medicine is the amount of preoperative education and the amount of postoperative support, you can regain your weight with surgical weight loss. I mean, it's possible. And, we've hit on this several times today. It requires lifestyle changes to be successful. It's a tool. Surgical weight loss is a tool, and it requires lifestyle changes. And so the data shows that the more support you have behind that, the more successful you're going to be. And so having your surgeon locally, where you can check in with them, where you can, or even telemedicine, but those just aren't offered in these situations. And so that's probably my biggest beef with that, is that you don't have the follow-up to be successful.
Right. Totally. In your clinic, tell me about your programs and things that you have to help people on their journey of bariatric surgery, post-bariatric surgery. Do you do some counseling, some therapy? Is there like psychology people in your clinic? Tell me about resources.
Absolutely. For anybody who's considering surgical weight loss, I would recommend that you find an accredited center. So they're accredited through the MBSA QIP, which is a big governing body that comes around every 3 years, does a site visit, make sure you have all of these different components. The reason that's important is because it delineates a comprehensive program. It says, hey, they have all of these components to help you be successful. So preoperatively, you sit down with a dietitian, you sit down with a psychologist or social worker. Post-operatively, those resources existed as well. There's expected lifetime follow-up. You follow labs. There can be individual coaching. So there's lots of different tools, and we even use medications as well. I mean, some patients, it's just like hypertension. If you treat hypertension with one medication and that's not enough, sometimes you have to add a second medication. Well, sometimes surgical weight loss patients do okay, but they need a little extra help, and so medications can help there as well. And so it's really having a comprehensive program with all of the components where patients are going to be most successful.
That's awesome. And your tell us about your shop. What is it called? Where is it located? And how can people get a hold of you? Obviously, I'll refer to you as well, but tell us about it. Yeah. I am part of Utah Surgical Associates. We are primarily in Utah County, and also have a group in St. George. We have here, what is the latest number? 13 different surgeons, of which 5 of us do bariatric surgery. Cool.
So we have docs in different offices throughout the county, so it can be closer to home wherever people are. And we have one of these comprehensive programs. We have a website, utahsurgical.com, where patients can go. They can see all of our profiles. They can actually even start the process through the website. They can call our office, start the process that way. And we usually start off with an educational video. This is what it is. These are the risks. That's what it's about. And then they come in for a visit where we look at their specific health condition and what would work best for you and what are your risks for surgery. And then we start them through this preoperative process in visiting with these different specialists that I've talked about. We do labs. They do an upper endoscopy. And all of that to then have the paperwork that an insurance company is going to need to approve the procedure. And if they are cash pay, then at that point we have the information we need to make sure they're going to be successful in what we're doing, and then schedule them and do the procedure. So that's kind of the basic outline of what patients will go through.
Cool. Lastly, just in closing, some of the malabsorption issues with some of these and other procedures, but like, what are there certain products that you like as far as vitamins that absorb differently or in different locations along the alimentary canal that you recommend post-operatively?
So we typically follow the ASMBS, the American Society for Metabolic and Bariatric Surgery, their recommendations. So every several years, they'll update their recommendations on what people should be taking. And currently, that is a bariatric multivitamin, which includes iron and 1,500 milligrams of calcium and 3,000 units of vitamin D. So those are the current recommendations.
And is that like a specific brand that is a bariatric multivitamin?
They don't endorse a specific brand. There are a handful of brands. We sell one in our office, but there are a handful of brands that cater to that market specifically. And their goal is, here, I want you to be able to take one pill instead of 5 pills, and try to make it simpler. And that's why I like using them, is because it gives what you need. For example, the recommendation on the multivitamin is it needs to be 200% of the recommended daily allowance. So if somebody's going to go and get their off-the-shelf multivitamin, it will work, but they have to take double the dose. And so if it's a 2 capsule, they're taking 4 capsules just to get their multivitamin, and then they still need their vitamin D, whereas the product we use has the vitamin D in it. And if theirs doesn't have iron, then you have to do a separate iron supplement. So it just makes it easier.
Berry melt is one that I've seen around, and they tend to like absorb through the oral mucosa and kind of down.
The one we sell is Bariatric Advantage.
Okay.
There's there was another one. The name escaped me. I have some patients who just don't like or can't handle the pills or the chewables. There are some patches available that patients like.
Interesting.
And we follow labs, and for the most part, they've been effective in doing that.
That's awesome.
Before we finish up, I do want to just mention, I mentioned there were some other operations, and there is one we offer in our office that I just want to make sure I hit on, because it's a newer operation, but I think it has an important place. It's called a SADS, or a single anastomosis duodenal-ileostomy with sleeve.
Wow.
So
that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. That's why everybody calls it a SADS. But it is specifically a malabsorptive operation. So its intent is malabsorption. So patients who have had this operation do have a little higher risk of chronic diarrhea, and they do have a little higher risk of protein malnutrition. However, it is very effective in helping patients get a significant amount of weight off and keep it off, and in treating type 2 diabetes. So nationally, most of the time when it's talked about for patients with a BMI of 50 and above, because they have a lot more weight to lose. They're, even if you look at just sleeve and bypass, they're not going to lose as much, or they're not going to get down to a quote unquote normal weight with those operations, where that would be more likely with this kind of more aggressive operation. It's a variant of an operation which has been around a long time called a duodenal switch, or a biliopancreatic diversion with duodenal switch. We have all these fancy names.
Acronyms in medicine are awesome. They're just awesome.
But that one again is a intentionally malabsorptive operation, and the SADS kind of falls between a bypass and a DS, or a duodenal switch, in its complexity and in its advantages. So you have patients BMI 50, 60 and above, a duodenal switch becomes a very good operation to be able to get a lot of weight off and keep that off. So I just wanted to bring those up to know they're out there. If somebody is visiting with a surgeon or surfing the internet, they may see these terms come up, and just kind of in completeness, those are currently available operations which have a place and work well. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for your knowledge and wisdom in this space, and just sharing it with my clients and with my community, our community. I think it's really cool. I feel like we're in a battle of the biochemists, right? Like you've got the biochemists who work for the food companies making things extra hyper delicious, and then the ones that work for pharma that fighting these guys. Oh, we can shut that down, the GLP-1s and GIPs. And then the surgeons who are like, well, guys, here's a surgical option for the battle as well. I hope that we can culturally shift what we're doing, the biochemists over here, where we're making so many processed hyper addictive foods, and I hope we can just recalibrate this whole ball game and put me and you out of jobs. That'd be wonderful. Absolutely. Let's do that. I think to your point, that's going to take really, in my opinion, grassroots movements, right? 100%. It's individuals saying, I'm tired of this. I want to live healthier. and then basically speaking with their pocketbook, purchasing products that are whole, natural, real foods that are how our bodies are designed to work, right? I mean, our bodies are designed to work with those foods, and we're going to be the healthiest and feel the best with those kinds of foods.
Avoiding 80% of the grocery store, which is the center, all the processed stuff, and just shopping around the
perimeter,
veggies and the meat and some dairy and maybe some whole grains over here. And 80% though is all that addictive stuff in the center, and it's really it's really a tricky spot for sure.
Absolutely.
Dr. Rasmussen, I want to thank you for your time. You're an incredible human, and I appreciate all the time, energy, effort that you have committed to your career, to the community, saving lives and helping people. And it's beautiful. It really is a fun adventure in medicine and in helping people, and I appreciate your work.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, and thanks for the work that you do, and trying to get this message out to people and help change lives.
To our clients, guys, I hope you learned some cool stuff today. I certainly did. And like and subscribe, do all the things. All right. Appreciate ya.